Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of One Room Schoolhouse. Today we want to talk a little bit more about kind of the rich heritage we have as Americans. One of the big things that we hear over and over again from places like the 1619 Project is that America was really founded as this nation for white people, by white people, and that legacy still haunts us today. That's the general narrative, but the issue with that is it's not necessarily based in much factual reality, right?
I like the way you say it, based in much factual reality. I'm not sure it's based in any factual
reality. Well, there
reality.
were white people back
there. There were white people.
But there was a lot of other people, too.
There were also a lot of people who weren't white back there. We've covered a lot of these folks at different times and some extended stories, but just go through them quickly here. Harry Hoosier, we are told that he's credited with the Hoosier State, Indiana Hoosier State being named after Harry Hoosier, who is a black man in the Great Awakenings who actually drew larger crowds than some of the notable white ministers did. And you have John Morant. And John Morant was in the First Great Awakening, came to God through the ministry of George Whitefield, and becomes the first black American successfully to evangelize Native Americans. And by the way, that was when he was 13 and 14 years old. And there was a narrative of his life back then that became one of the best-selling narratives of any black person in that era. It was just a phenomenal narrative, still fun to read today. This is back to the American War of Independence. This is Peter Salem. He was the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And also in the Battle of Bunker Hill, you had Salem Poor, who received nearly a dozen military commendations from leaders saying, this guy is significant. He needs to be really honored. You got folks like Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes was a Minuteman in the American Revolution. He's the first black man to receive a degree of higher education in America. He is also noted for several other things. He's the first black man to have any kind of a sermon published. And there's old paintings back from the day, and of course this is just a foam board of it, but this is Lemuel Haynes actually preaching in a church. So you look at the congregation and they're all white, which was not all that unusual for many black ministers back in that day, not the tone we would hear today, but a great guy with Lemuel Haynes. Then you have actually Phyllis Wheatley, the first black poetess in America, and her poetry is so significant that George Washington actually brings her to the Continental Army and has her read poetry to the officers. So, I mean, he thought her poetry was outstanding, and this is really kind of the hero of the end of the American Revolution. James Armistead, the first double spy in American history, and you can look at the writings of George Washington Lafayette, and he really gets a lot of the credit for the war having come to the end when it did. It could have gone a lot longer. He shaves who knows how many months, years off, how many countless lives were saved. Then you get right after the American Revolution, you have Richard Allen. And Richard Allen was in the American Revolution. He was one of the soldiers then. And he's actually the founder of the first black denomination in America. Great story. His is another really good selling narrative from early America. This is Absalom Jones. He's the first black man ordained in a national recognized denomination in America. So he's an Episcopalian priest. And so Absalom Jones, he also helped Richard Allen start the first black denomination. You have Benjamin Banneker, who is really responsible for laying out a lot of Washington, D.C. He's the surveyor that Thomas Jefferson contacted. There's just so many black folks back there we don't hear much about today that are very significant. And you're right, people think it's an all-white American founding. It's not.
But obviously, as you just did in 2.5 minutes, there's so much more to the story, and there's so many people, because we went through a whole bunch of black Americans who really are just American heroes. They're our heroes. They're part of our founding story.
Which, by the way, obviously, we're white guys, so what do we do with black history? And our answer is real simple.
It's American history.
They're American heroes. It's American history. Doesn't matter what color you are, these are heroes. And that's the way we recognize it. That's kind of God's view of it, is He doesn't look at the skin color. He looks at what's on the inside, and that's the way we look at heroes.
Yeah, so much courage, so much patriotism, so many heroics that were done by that group of individuals. Just incredible stories, all of them. Several of the guys that you mentioned were soldiers in the Revolutionary War, and one of the interesting things that we've been learning a lot about is the fact that the Revolutionary Army underneath George Washington was one of the most integrated fighting forces really up until after the Second World War in our history. And during the Revolutionary period, typically you would have guys that would volunteer enlistments, and so for generally the whites, they would only enlist for about 6 months, right? That's more or less one season, and then they'd go back. But the African American soldiers would enlist for up to 9 times longer than that. And so generally by the end of the...
So we're talking 4.5 years?
Yeah, basically the entire conflict.
Wow.
And so by the end of the war, some of the most veteran and probably most skilled fighting force in the war would have been these African American soldiers fighting in many times integrated units, being like, Peter Salem, the heroes of some of these battles. But today, even from places like the 1619 Project, they don't talk about any of those heroes because it undermines their narrative that America is this racist, terrible nation. While obviously bad things have happened in our nation's past, because it's filled with humans, there's also been a lot of amazing things that have happened.
And going back to the 1619 narrative, which really their point is there was no black heroes back then. Oh yeah, there were, and a whole lot more than what we just mentioned. And so their narrative is kind of like it's all a bunch of rich white guys. Well, how about all the women that were significantly involved in this? I mean, significant roles that the women played in it. And then Hispanics. There were a lot of Hispanic heroes as well. Even the ladies of Cuba who got together and raised collections and sent to George Washington to keep the army in the field, to keep fighting against the British. And then you get to looking at Washington's generals. Washington had 76 generals that are identified. 28 of those 76 generals came from foreign nations.
Wow.
This is actually a lithograph. It is not one that's sold in America. This was actually done for over in Europe. And what you have here is, there's George Washington right here, but underneath, these are all sorts of generals from Europe who came and fought in the American War for Independence. So down here as you go across, you've got DeKalb and you've got Pulaski. Pulaski and Thaddeus Kosciuszko were from Poland, or Poland, Lithuania, some will claim today. But you have several guys from Prussia. You have Muhlenberg from Germany. You have von Steuben from Prussia. Just so many of these guys, Count de Grasse and Lafayette from France. America really was a melting pot back then, and there's a lot of proof to that. It's just that we don't get that image today. It's like it's an all men, rich white guys club, and it is not. There's so much more to the story.
And obviously when people like us today look back on an image like this, oftentimes we'll just glance at it and think, oh, all those guys look white, so that's probably it. But when we just divide people based on their skin color alone, we lose a lot of the inherent diversity that is in that picture, right? Because you have Washington, but then you have people from all across the world bringing their cultures, bringing their talents, bringing their stories. And when we just paint with broad brushes, we lose so much of the diversity.
And notice that the unity, the diversity, and the unity was around ideas. They came here and fought for ideas. They fought for liberty. They fought for freedom. And it wasn't just for white guys, because they're fighting for everyone. As a matter of fact, Thaddeus Kosciuszko and Pulaski both came here as huge anti-slavery guys. And
Lafayette too.
Lafayette too, you're right. And Thaddeus Kosciuszko was a wealthy nobleman from Poland, and he took his wealth and left it in America and said, I want you to use this to free blacks in the South everywhere you can.
Wow.
So there was common ideas around which the world gathered, and it wasn't just around color or skin or geographic areas. And the focus of America, the unity we've had for years, has been built around the same philosophical ideas with which we can agree, the core ideas. There's still a lot of different stuff out there, and everybody's got their individual beliefs, but we have central core ideals, and that's why people came here. That's why other nations came here and fought for it. That's why people of different racial backgrounds did the same thing. It was core ideas, and that's still what's key today.
Yeah, and if you want to find out more about these core ideas, these principles upon which America was founded and built, I would highly suggest read a document called the Declaration of Independence. It's pretty good, and it has a lot of those in there. But also, if you want to find out more about the American story, you can get our book online at WallBuilders.com, The American Story, The Beginnings, and it goes through a lot of these people, a lot of their stories, and provide you with a lot of the sources to continue your own study and go beyond what we've talked about in this video and in some of our other videos to find out more about the real history that a lot of people don't really want you to know about today, it seems like. But there's so much more to the story than what we get. And so join us next time on the One Room Schoolhouse.